The Pe-2 was the most produced Soviet bomber of the Second World War and arguably the most important. Crews called it the Peshka, the pawn. It flew on every front from the Arctic to the Black Sea with the Air Force and with naval aviation, doing everything from pinpoint dive bombing to long-range reconnaissance, and in its heavy fighter form, air-to-air work. The story began in mid-1938 at TSKB-29, a prison design bureau run by the NKVD, a sharashka in the slang of the camps. Almost the whole team were prisoners, engineers arrested as, in the language of the time, enemies of the people and saboteurs. The prisoners actually ran the place. The NKVD officers were in charge on paper. Chief designer Vladimir Petlyakov had headed an experimental design bureau before his arrest in 1938. As one of Andrei Tupolev's closest deputies, he helped create the INT-2, TB-1, TB-3, and the giant ANT-20 Maxim Gorky, then led the team designing a new heavy bomber, the TB-7, later redesignated PE-8. Then the purges caught up with him. Tupolev went first, and dozens of other aircraft designers with him. Then they came for Petlyakov, who was sent to TSKB-29, where he again worked under Tupolev, also a prisoner. The Pe-2 did not start life as a bomber at all. It started as a high-altitude interceptor, built to stop bomber fleets that, as it turned out, nobody was going to send. Foreign designs of that era were still experimental and nowhere near combat-ready, so the requirement quietly went away. The war confirmed the call. No Axis power ever fielded high-altitude bombers in numbers. Germany had a handful of U-86P, U-86R, and HS-130 aircraft, used mostly for strategic reconnaissance. They were never a real threat. Italy had none. Japan had nothing in that class at all. The first true production high-altitude bomber with pressurized crew compartments and turbocharged engines was the American Boeing B-29 Superfortress, which did not fly its first combat mission until 1944 in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's standard medium bomber, the Tupolev SB, dated from 1934 and had been in mass production since 1936. It was badly outdated by now, as the Winter War showed, when Soviet crews struggled even against modest Finnish opposition. The country urgently needed a modern tactical bomber it could build in quantity, and the High Command turned to a new idea: dive bombing. The United States Navy pioneered it and built purpose-designed dive bombers to sink ships. Ernst Udet brought 2 Curtiss Hawk IIs back from America, and what he demonstrated with them helped sell German commanders on the idea. Germany's first dive bomber, the Henschel HS-123, followed soon after, built for the newly formed Luftwaffe. In Germany, the idea took off fast. Commanders saw it as the ideal close air support tool for fast-moving motorized forces. A dive bomber could hit things a level bomber could never touch: individual tanks, armored vehicles, pillboxes, gun pits, field fortifications just behind the lines. They were flying artillery, keeping up with the panzers when the towed guns couldn't. On the eve of the Second World War, Germany began mass-producing the famous U-87, the Stuka, short for Sturzkampfflugzeug, German for dive bomber. Soviet pilots and infantry nicknamed it the Lapat, a peasant's woven bark sandal, for those big fixed wheels in their spats. The Germans used it to great effect in Poland, in France, and in the opening months of Barbarossa. Dive bombing was also built into medium bombers like the U-88 and Do-217. Soviet engineers got to crawl over U-88A1s in 1940, bought openly from Germany under the trade deal that came with the pact. The first Soviet purpose-built dive bomber was the IR-2, developed under Alexander Arkhangelsky as a heavily reworked SB. Built alongside what became the Pe-2, it reached production much faster since the factories were already tooled for the older design. But the SB airframe was tapped out. There was nothing left in it. Nikolai Polikarpov then built just 5 SPB aircraft, which were better armed and flatly faster than the IR-2. Flight testing was plagued by fatal crashes. The crashes kept killing crews, the fixes never took, and the program was shut down. So Petlyakov's bureau got urgent orders to convert his Vi-100 high-altitude fighter into a dive bomber. They were given 6 weeks. At first, they wanted to carry the fighter's best tricks over to the bomber, designated PB-100, pressurized crew compartments and turbochargers. There were to be 2 of those compartments, a forward one for the pilot and an aft one for the navigator and the radio operator gunner. The navigator also got a second set of controls and basic instruments in case the pilot was killed or knocked out. Fixed forward armament was planned as either 4 7.62 mm Shkas machine guns or a pair of 20 mm Shvak cannons plus 2 Shkas. The prototype got the heavier fit. The gunner's mount was genuinely futuristic, remotely controlled, and aimed through a periscope, though it was never fitted to the prototype. Standard bomb load was about 1,300 pounds in the center section bay, plus another 900 pounds externally for short-range sorties for roughly 2,200 pounds in all. Almost none of that survived to production. Turbochargers and pressurized compartments were tested on the prototype 100, then dropped. The Air Force wanted no part of that much complication on an aircraft they would be building by the thousand. Soviet analysts also predicted that most air combat would happen at low and medium altitude, and they were dead right. The air war over the Eastern Front was fought low, so the PB-100 was redesigned, simpler and more conventional. No pressurized compartments, and instead of turbochargers, the M105R engines got standard mechanical superchargers. Flight testing of the prototype 100 went badly from the start. Veteran test pilot Pyotr Stefanovsky was flying when the right engine quit. He barely got the crippled aircraft back onto the field, clearing a tall hangar and a stack of scaffolding by feet. The second prototype fared worse. Crewed by Anatoly Kripkov and Pyotr Perevalov, it caught fire right after takeoff. Blinded by thick smoke, the pilot crash-landed on the first patch of ground he could find, and several people on the ground were killed. Despite the accidents, the numbers were good, and the Soviet leadership pushed the aircraft into production. The prototype flew over Red Square in the May Day parade that year. State trials ended May 10, 1940, and on June 23, the aircraft was ordered into production. The production version changed in several ways. Most obviously, the cockpit moved forward. Right behind the pilot, slightly to the right, sat the navigator. The lower nose was glazed so he could aim precisely on a bombing run, and for defense he had a flexible rearward-firing Shkas. Behind the wing sat the radio operator gunner with a second Shkas and a belly hatch firing down and back. With war looming, time was short. There was never a pattern aircraft built first. They picked one off the early production line afterward and called it the Standard. State trials for the dive bomber didn't happen until January and February of 1941. That was standard practice then, not just in the Soviet Union, but in Britain, the United States, and Germany, where aircraft were routinely rushed into production before testing finished. Production went to Moscow Factory No. 22, which had built IR-2s. The full set of production drawings arrived in July 1940, and the first dive bomber rolled out by year's end. That same year, under a new system naming aircraft after their chief designers, the PB-100 became the PE-2. Petlyakov's team still worked under NKVD control, while engineer Alexander Pudilov ran the transition to mass production. Production? PE-2s used M105R engines rated at 1,100 horsepower for takeoff, with gear-driven centrifugal superchargers and variable pitch propellers. Being liquid-cooled, they had radiators buried in the wing on both sides of each engine with oil coolers directly beneath. Cooling air exited through louvers on the upper wing surface. They were started with compressed air. Fuel sat in a main fuselage tank, 2 wing center section tanks, and 2 more in the outer panels behind the engines. All tanks were self-sealing, and an inert gas system fed by cooled exhaust dramatically cut the chance of a fire when they were hit. About 50 electric motors in 5 different types from 30 to 1,700 watts ran the aircraft's systems: radiator shutters, propeller pitch, pumps, valves, and flaps. They also worked the dive brakes, slatted lattice panels under the outer wings that held airspeed within safe limits in a dive. The pilot put the brakes out going in, and the AP-1 automatic dive recovery system pulled the aircraft out. It could carry high explosive, fragmentation, and special purpose bombs, concrete piercing, chemical, even flares, up to about 2,200 pounds in all. The biggest single weapon was the Fab 500, 500 kilos, about 1,100 pounds. Around 1,300 pounds went in the main fuselage bay and in small compartments at the rear of the engine nacelles, each holding a single Fab 100. The rest hung on external racks. In a dive, bombs could only be released from those external racks since there was no bomb crutch to swing a load clear of the fuselage bay, so for dive bombing, the whole load went outside. Crews were cleared for dives up to 70 degrees. Unlike the SB, the Pe-2 had no chemical spray tanks. For its size, the Pe-2's payload was modest, for two reasons. The airframe was heavy from its extremely rugged construction, inherited from its heavy fighter origins and typical of dive bombers, which have to be built to take punishing G-loads on the pullout, and it was underpowered, which reflected the broader lag in Soviet engine development. The cockpit housing the pilot and navigator was well equipped for its era, with an ATP artificial horizon and an ARPK-2 radio direction finder. Gyro instruments were scarce and there was no autopilot, but that rarely mattered because the Pe-2 worked low and close to the lines. A 9mm armor plate protected the pilot from behind, and during the war, the navigator got a 6mm side plate. For 1940, the Pe-2 was genuinely fast. Clean, without external bomb racks, its top speed nearly equaled that of Germany's frontline fighter of the day, the Messerschmitt Bf 109E. The closest comparison is another twin-engine machine in a similar role, the German Junkers Ju-88. Built for level and dive bombing and used through the war for reconnaissance, torpedo strikes, and heavy fighter work. Most other dive bombers worldwide were smaller single-engine types made mainly for carrier or maritime work. The 1940 production Ju-88A4 was larger and heavier, with a payload up to 6,600 pounds, more defensive guns, and longer range. But it was about 50 miles an hour slower, its ceiling was roughly 2,000 feet lower, and it could not turn or climb with the Pe-2. Production climbed fast. By spring 1941, the first bombers were reaching combat units. On May 1st, a whole regiment of Pe-2s under Colonel Sergei Pestov flew in formation over Red Square. When Germany invaded, the Soviet Air Force had 458 Pe-2s, a drop in the bucket against a force of thousands. In the Western military districts on June 22, 1941, alongside 377 obsolete SBs, there were only 42 Pe-2s, 22 IR-2s, and 24 Yak-4s. The SBs made up the great bulk of the bomber force up front. Nor did all the Pe-2s reach their units on time. In June 1941, 30 of them were stranded near Minsk and commandeered by the 13th Bomber Aviation Division under Fyodor Polinov, whose crews taught themselves to fly the aircraft and took it into combat over Belarus. Soviet pilots had no time to master the aircraft before heavy combat began. It was made worse by tricky handling, a dive-bombing doctrine no Soviet crew had ever trained for, and not a single dual-control trainer. The design's own flaws didn't help. The landing gear shock absorbers were weak. The fuselage sealed badly so fuel vapor could pool, and that made fires more likely. Pilots found takeoff and landing far more demanding than in the SB or the DB-3 or the Lend-Lease Boston. And the aircrew force was expanding faster than it could be trained. In the Leningrad military district, more than half the pilots had left flight school only in the fall of 1940, with minimal hours logged. Even so, Pe-2 units were in the fight from the war's opening months. On the afternoon of June 22, 1941, 17 Pe-2s of the 5th Bomber Aviation Regiment struck the Galitz Bridge over the Prut River. The Pe-2 was fast enough and agile enough to go out in daylight even with the Luftwaffe owning the sky. On October 5, 1941, Senior Lieutenant Gorslikin's crew held off 9 Bf-109s at the same time and shot 3 of them down. Combat forced constant refinement, starting with the guns. 4 rifle-caliber Peshkas just didn't have the punch to keep German fighters off, especially since Pe-2s often flew without escort. Complaints from the squadrons about the belly gun jamming forced a quick redesign of the ammunition feed. Then came a radical decision. The right-hand nose Peshkas was swapped for a 12.7mm UB, with the same weapon under the fuselage. It hit far harder than the Shkas, and at the ranges a bomber's gunners actually fired at, it had real reach. Not long after, the improved M105RA arrived. The same power, better reliability. Production kept climbing. By December 1st, 1941, total output had passed 1,600 aircraft, including Pe-3 heavy fighters, with 4 major plants building them at once. That October, one main factory was evacuated to Kazan, where a massive complex was thrown up for Pa-2 production. The design kept changing right alongside the production ramp. Engineers cut back the nose glazing, and in late 1941, facing a severe metal shortage, Kazan engineers drew up a wooden tail section fitted to some aircraft through late 1941 and 1942. On January 12, 1942, chief designer Vladimir Petlyakov was killed. The Pe-2 carrying him to Moscow flew into a severe snowstorm, the crew lost the horizon, and the aircraft went into a hillside near Arzamas. Alexander Isaacson briefly took over as chief designer, then Alexander Putilov. The front needed bombers, and it needed them now, so the factories were run flat out. In early 1942, Kazan was shipping up to 13 aircraft a day. In March, a single Kazan factory turned out 108 Pe-2s. By December, monthly output hit 210. Streamlined manufacturing nearly halved the labor per airplane that year, from 25,000 man-hours down to about 13,000. And the aircraft kept getting deadlier. The rifle-caliber Shkas at the navigator's station was replaced by a heavy 12.7mm UBT on the same pintle mount. Field units had already been doing this themselves. Now the factories shipped conversion kits, and field service teams fitted them on the airfields. Engineers also designed retractable ski landing gear. Unlike the Il-2 setup, the Pe-2 kept its standard wheel nacelles and used bolted-on fairings to enclose the retracted skis. The skis never caught on. Refinement continued. The old radio direction finder was replaced by a better model, though through late 1941 and early 1942, it went mainly to reconnaissance Pe-2s. In June 1942, the navigator's open gun mount made way for a more effective enclosed turret. Everyone calls this version the Pe-2 FT for Frontovoye Trebovanaya, frontline requirement, because that is where the demand came from. The factory simply called it a late production Pe-2. Designers also upgraded the armor and added a flexible Shkas for the gunner, movable from one side to the other in about 30 seconds. The radio operator gunner fired through small round ports in the fuselage sides, and there are documented cases of exceptionally strong crewmen firing at handheld, leaning out the upper hatch with nothing but a small flip-up wind deflector against the slipstream. The electrical, hydraulic, and fuel systems were reworked from end to end. From the fall of 1941, Pe-2s were in action everywhere along the Eastern Front, and with naval aviation in the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. New regiments were being stood up faster than crews could be trained, and the best pilots in the country, test pilots among them, were pulled together into a single all-Pe-2 regiment. In the decisive counteroffensive outside Moscow, Pe-2s were about a quarter of every bomber committed. Still, production fell short. Of nearly 200 Soviet bombers assembled near Stalingrad in July 1942, only 14 were Pe-2s plus a single Pe-3, well under a tenth of the force. Pe-2 regiments were shuttled from front to front and thrown into the hottest fighting. Near Stalingrad, the 150th Bomber Aviation Regiment distinguished itself under Colonel Ivan Polbin, a future general and Air Corps commander, drawing the most critical missions. It would later be renamed the 35th Guards. Having mastered dive bombing, its crews hit with devastating effect in broad daylight, destroying a massive German fuel depot near Morozovsk. When the Germans tried to fly supplies into the pocket at Stalingrad, the dive bombers went after the transports on their own airfields. In late December 1942, 6 Pe-2s from Polbin's regiment destroyed 20 U-52 transports on the ground at Tormosin. That same winter, Baltic Fleet dive bombers blew up a vital bridge over the Narva River, cutting the supply line that fed the German armies around Leningrad. Rebuilding it took the enemy a full month. Soviet dive bomber tactics evolved fast. Toward the end of Stalingrad, instead of small flights of 3 to 9 aircraft, commanders began assembling strike groups of 30 to 70. That is where Polbin's carousel came from, a huge tilted wheel of dive bombers, each one covering the tail of the aircraft ahead, taking turns rolling in on the target. In the street fighting at Stalingrad, Pe-2s flew low-altitude strikes with exceptional precision. Experienced pilots were still critically scarce. Dive bombing took nerve and a lot of practice, and there was time for neither, so most crews bombed from level flight. In 1943, Vladimir Petlyakov took over the design bureau. Another formerly imprisoned engineer, he would later become a prominent designer of heavy strategic bombers. His first job, make the Pe-2 survivable against a Luftwaffe that had gotten a lot better. The Luftwaffe's hardware was improving fast. As early as the fall of 1941, new Bf-109F fighters appeared, roughly 30 miles an hour faster than the Pe-2 between 10,000 and 13,000 feet. Though much higher up, they lost that edge. In late 1942, Germany fielded the even more powerful Bf-109G with heavier firepower and more armor, and in 1943 the Fw-190A, previously used only in Western Europe. The Pe-2 needed to claw back enough speed to stay out of trouble. Instead, the top speed of 1942 aircraft had dropped slightly from the pre-war machines. It had gotten heavier, more guns, more armor, and build quality had slipped. Factories were staffed mostly by women and teenagers who, despite their best efforts, lacked veteran workers' experience, so problems cropped up with aerodynamic sealing and panel fit. Real improvement demanded more engine power, so the M105RA went out in favor of the M105PF, rated at 1,210 horsepower on takeoff. There wasn't much choice. The old engines were going out of production as Klimov tooled up for the new one. Originally developed for the Yak-1, Yak-7, and Lag-3 fighters, and designed to take a hub-firing cannon, the M105PF was optimized for low and medium altitudes, so the Pe-2 got faster down low and out to about 13,000 feet and slower above that. Worse, it kept propellers matched to the earlier engines, so the new power plant never reached its full potential. Even so, the upgrade was a real step forward because the gain came in the altitude band that mattered most at the front. Down low, top speed rose about 15 miles an hour. Field units often fitted the new engines to earlier aircraft. Old and new cowlings were not interchangeable, since the propeller shaft on the new motor sat a couple of inches higher, so ground crews cut the old cowlings apart and riveted new fairings on by hand. From 1943, the Pe-2 was the standard Soviet tactical bomber. Outdated SBs went to training and transport units, and most of the few IR-2s and Yak-4s had already been lost at the front. In the summer of 1943, Pe-2s saw heavy action at Kursk, where their bombing accuracy made them genuinely dangerous. On July 16th alone, 115 bombers of the 3rd Bomber Aviation Corps claimed 55 tanks, better than 200 trucks, and 7 fuel and ammunition dumps on the Central Front. In 1944, a new round of refinements focused on aerodynamics. Designers fitted fairings over the dive brakes, improved fuselage sealing, and upgraded the navigator's turret. You can spot that one by the single big blister on the turret instead of 2 little ones. They redesigned the lower cowling panel, fitted new air intake scoops, and moved the radio mast forward along with the pitot tube. On hundreds of aircraft, individual ejector exhaust stacks replaced the shared collector manifolds for a little extra speed. In 1943, a new variant appeared with M82 radial engines producing 1,540 horsepower. Top speed and service ceiling rose only modestly, and switching engines risked slowing mass production. So only 135 rolled off the line in 1944, before the factories went back to the proven M105PF, by then redesignated VK105PF. All 135 still reached combat units and saw active service, notably with a squadron of the 99th Separate Reconnaissance Aviation Regiment. The external bomb rack beams used to stick out under teardrop fairings. A bit later, engineers buried them in the wing, and new Vish-61P propellers began going on at the same time. The 1944 aircraft were slightly heavier, standard takeoff weight rising to 17,600 pounds from 17,000. Even so, the cleaner airframe was worth anywhere from a few to about 20 miles an hour over the 1943 machines. Upgrades kept coming. A new radio set roughly doubled the range crews could talk over. Against attacks from behind, some bombers carried the DAG-10 grenade dispenser, 10 IG-2 aerial grenades, in two 5-round cassettes stowed in the radio operator gunner's station. Once dropped, a grenade was slowed by a small parachute and exploded 3 to 5 seconds later right in front of an attacking fighter. Field repair units had been fitting these to PE-2s and PE-3s as early as December 1941, notably in the 9th Separate Bomber Aviation Regiment. The cockpit kept changing too. The radio operator gunner's upper hatch was redesigned, and the individual exhaust stacks eventually became standard on all production aircraft. Sights, radios, oxygen kit, instruments, all of it kept getting improved. In 1945, they went further, fairings over the flexible schkaz mounts, tape over the wing root fillet gaps. The fuel and oil systems were fiddled with constantly. In winter, the oil was diluted with gasoline for easier cold starts, and later a proper cold weather starting rig was added. In 1945, extra equipment pushed takeoff weight up again to around 18,500 pounds. But thanks to the aerodynamic cleanup, performance with the same engines didn't drop at all. It actually got a little better. In 1944, new Tu-2 bombers began arriving in numbers, better than the PE-2 in just about every way that counted. The Tu-2 had first appeared back in 1942, but only in 1s and 2s. That December, a single aircraft flew reconnaissance over the Demyansk pocket, and at Kursk only 18 were operational within Colonel Vladimir Sandolov's 285th Bomber Aviation Division, mostly on reconnaissance. By May 1944, the entire 334th Bomber Aviation Division under Colonel Ivan Skok was flying combat missions near Leningrad. Right to the last day of the war, though, Petlyakov's design was the backbone of the Soviet bomber force. In 1944, PE-2s took part in nearly all the major Soviet offensives. In February, 9 of them destroyed a bridge across the Dnieper near Rogachev, cutting off the German retreat and stranding enemy forces against the river. At the start of the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky offensive, the 202nd Bomber Aviation Division worked over the German airfields at Uman and Kristinivka. In March, PE-2s of the 36th Bomber Aviation Regiment destroyed enemy crossings over the Dniester. They also proved extremely effective in the rugged Carpathians. For the opening air bombardment of Operation Bagration, 548 PE-2s went in at once. On June 29th, they dropped the bridge over the Berezina with a precision strike, closing the last escape route for the German divisions trapped east of Minsk. Soviet naval aviation used PE-2s hard against enemy shipping. Their short legs and thin navigation kit were a real problem over water, but in the Baltic and the Black Sea, they were remarkably effective. In July 1944, PE-2 crews sank the German cruiser Niobe at Kotka, convinced right up to the moment of the attack that they were bombing the Finnish coastal defense ship Viinamoinen. They also sank a string of large enemy transports. By 1944, the Soviet Air Force's average bombing accuracy was up about a tenth on the year before, and the battle-tested PE-2, which crews knew inside and out, was a major reason. PE-2s flew in every major operation of the last year of the war. They were everywhere over Eastern Europe, giving close air support to fast-advancing ground forces. They played a key role in the assault on Königsberg and the naval base at Pillau. In the massive Berlin operation, 743 PE-2 and Tu-2 dive bombers filled the skies. On April 30th, 1945, one of the targets on the list was Gestapo headquarters in the middle of Berlin. The PE-2 likely flew its last European combat sortie on May 7, 1945, cratering the strip at Sirava in the Courland Pocket to stop the last Germans there from flying out to Sweden. The PE-2 also fought in the lightning Soviet offensive into Manchuria. In heavy strikes on the Korean ports of Racine and Seychin, dive bombers of the 34th Bomber Aviation Regiment sank 3 transports and 2 tankers, and badly damaged 5 more supply ships. Full-scale production wound up over the winter of 1945 to 1946, with 11,247 Pe-2s of all variants built, more than any other Soviet bomber of the era. By comparison, all DB-3 and Il-4 variants combined came to 6,784 aircraft, and only 2,527 Tu-2s were built, most of them after the war. Immediately after the war, the Soviet Air Force began phasing the Pe-2 out in favor of the much more modern Tu-2. The Pe-2 was not flown by the Soviet Union alone. In the spring of 1944, near Kharkiv, the 1st Polish Composite Air Corps began forming, with its bomber regiment on Pe-2s. There were almost no trained Polish airmen to draw on, so much of the air crew and nearly all the ground crews came from Soviet regiments. These units flew in the final assault on Berlin. Polish Pe-2s stayed in service well into the post-war years, still flying as late as 1951. And the Poles even converted one into a flying testbed for early jet engines. Beyond Poland, the type served after the war with Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and China. In Czechoslovakia, it was designated B-32, the trainer version CB-32. Ironically, these aircraft also served with one of the Soviet Union's own wartime enemies, Finland. The Finns bought 6 Pe-2s from Germany, early machines captured in the Western Soviet Union in 1941. The Germans had already rebuilt them. German instruments, German radios, German standards. A 7th fell into Finnish hands after a forced landing. The 8th and last was bought from Germany by the Finnish Air Force in 1944. And given a complete overhaul and a similar refit at the Letov factory in Czechoslovakia. All 8 joined a single Finnish squadron, saw heavy combat, and served until 1946. The easy way to spot a Finnish one was the gun sight, bolted to the outside of the nose right in front of the windscreen. As the mainstay of the Soviet bomber fleet, the Pe-2 played a pivotal role in the Second World War. It succeeded as a dive bomber, as a reconnaissance aircraft, and even as a heavy fighter. The only job it never took on was torpedo bomber. In the hands of a crew who knew it, it was a genuinely dangerous airplane. Speed and handling were what it was known for, that and how much punishment it would take. Crews loved it, often preferring it to the Lend-Lease types. From the first day of the war to the last, the Peshka carried the load. For a pawn, it turned out to be one of the most valuable pieces the Soviet Union had.